When we started this series, the mission statement was quite simple. We wanted to build a dungeon, a city, and a wilderness that a party of adventurers could explore and have some fun in. At the time, I was perfectly fine with having these three places be fairly separate and disconnected, considering any deeper lore or campaign ties a sort of fringe benefit, and the only thing I really wanted to get chiseled out as a connecting tissue is the ShadowDark itself. However, with what we've built so far, it's looking exceedingly likely that what we actually have here is a pretty well-matched handful of puzzle pieces that, when put together, will lay the foundation for a fairly interesting and potentially rather epic and high-powered campaign, at least as we approach the later levels. And all it really takes for that to work is to put the pieces next to one another and add one final but very substantial and important piece. And that, of course, is how pantheons, deities, and other immortal entities fit into our picture here. Hello friends, Anderson here, welcome back to these darkened places where we're starting to put things together, because it looks like a picture emerges, and the picture is of course emerging through our powers combined through whatever is happening on the screen here right now and in the previous episodes, and what's happening under the little video box in the comments, where some rather thought-provoking input has nudged me in a direction that I originally didn't really expect to get from this campaign setup, which is the potential to build something rather cohesive that would allow for, if we play our cards right in the campaign play, a rather more high-stakes, more epic sort of story to come out of all of this. And for that we need to figure out a few things about the ShadowDark and about Koroth and how and why this all came to be and came to pass. As always, thanks for your continued attention, participation, and comments. Feel free to like and subscribe and all of that, of course. It's always much appreciated, and it's no exaggeration to say that this build would look rather different had I done this on my own. Now, speaking of comments, there's one despair-centric thing left to do here that I said at the end of last episode we would start with, which is to figure out what ails the land of Corva, the lowlands to the west of our mountain range that houses Grave Hollow. And my instinctive reaction at the end of last episode was that whatever's driving this despair shouldn't be connected to our other potential goings-on or Koroth-centric topics, because it hadn't quite hit me yet that it would actually make it more interesting if these things and places were connected, albeit perhaps not directly. And with that in mind, I would like to only do this rather superficially until we have fleshed out the whole Koroth ShadowDark topic and what is actually happening right now with regards to shadow-darkened activity in our setting. But a superficial idea of what's happening I feel like we can pick up on, because we did get some input in that regard from Patrick in the comments, who suggested that maybe what's happening is some calamity where these lowlands are slowly being eaten up by an encroaching desert, perhaps. And I think that opens up a lot of interesting options for explanations and tie-ins for any kind of Koroth storyline. So I think I'd like to go with that. And I'd also like to pick up on the prompt itself that's in the name, where we're being told that these are the lowlands of Corva. And I'm reading this a bit like perhaps this isn't so much a monolithic nation as much as a lowland steppe filled with all sorts of subgroups that share this area. And it's quite a vast expanse where the lowlands of Corva are merely the part that is adjacent to our mountain range, but it's a fairly unbroken stretch that goes very, very far west, and that's also where I would like to put the source of our desert. So we don't really have encroaching desert right here. It's not at the lowlands of Corva yet. What is actually causing the despair in this expansive steppe region is the fact that there is an encroaching desert far to the west that is driving a whole bunch of traffic into the eastern parts that haven't been affected yet. And of course, this puts a strain on territorial topics, the distribution of resources, the predominance in certain areas, and creates all kinds of friction and war and conflict that then in turn also would drive further traffic into our mountain ranges and maybe even across into this area that is currently also being accosted by the 100 Truths, making this a whole messy melting pot and potentially also causing further resource strain in our Grave Hollow area because they're already hard pressed and they are receiving an influx now from the uprooted denizens of the lowlands of Corva. I think that's something we can cook with for now, knowing that, and we may extrapolate what's actually causing this desert once we have a little bit of a better idea of what elements we can still put into play and what is going on. And to that effect, we need to start on the gods. I just made a little note here about the lowlands of Corva. So, the gods. But not only the gods, also the ShadowDark and the making of the world. And I think this is naturally all connected, and it almost begins, I would have to say, with the ShadowDark. As it should, because I intended this to be a very central theme of this campaign and world building, and so far, while it's always been present, I think it deserves a bit more focus. And in the context of the whys of this world, I think the ShadowDark is a very integral part. Now, for all of this to make some semblance of sense, the way it currently is all kind of muddled up in my brain, I'll need to break this down as an answer to the various prompts and concepts we've already generated. So I'm not gonna throw out a whole bunch of new stuff here to work with. I'm gonna pick up on everything we have so far. And one of the main pieces that finally made it click for me as to why this world is and why it is the way it is was actually something we generated recently in the Darkened Deeps, this underground stretch of Underdark sub-world that exists, well, where? To my mind, pretty much everywhere under the world. That was something I was thinking about based on one of the comments by Shrimp is Delicious, who asked whether the Darkened Deep potentially stretch all the way under Runekel, maybe even under Southfall. And my idea was that yes, that certainly is the case. And I was thinking about this, trying to figure out, okay, does that mean it's possible to traverse the entire world underground, even if it's a very hostile trek? And that made me think that in a way, yes, but if we think of the world as sort of like various layers, you've got your celestial bodies like all the way at the top, and then you have your like ground level, naturally, with all kinds of mountain ranges and sea levels that are giving it some variance. And then I think we have this occasionally broken layer that's already indicated by the existence of our chasms and such. And I feel like above and around this is this elemental, almost like a buffer zone that exists with purpose. It exists to make these incursions of the darkness that is below here harder. It's containing the ShadowDark that basically is pooled all the way at the bottom of the world's layer, or if we think of the world as a sphere, then it's at the core, and the elemental mantle around the core basically keeps it contained in there for the most part. And the ShadowDark will also have these elemental layers that go up and down into it that disconnect pockets of darkness from one another, which then also serves to split up its strength. But it's down here. And then I was thinking, like, well, what if it's down there and it's not happy about it, to the extent that it has this fundamental consciousness and it understands it's locked up there, and its driving purpose is to escape its prison at the core of the world. And to that effect, it's almost something we can visualize as this pool of malignant conscious darkness that shoves its tendrils all the way around the underground, this planet's entire matter, and every now and again it just succeeds in hollowing out another segment. And the further up we go, the less directly powerful it becomes, and the more it has to work through minions and other creatures. So if we picture the areas that are more likely to be traversed by people that go into the darkened deeps, these tunnels will have been created not maybe directly by the tendrils of the ShadowDark, but by some colossal shadow worms that eat their way all the way from the core to the top. And there is this whole underground ecosystem that also contains then counter forces against these ShadowDark minions that are in place. And that's why there's also some opposition down there, because there are some good aligned forces down there whose purpose it is to serve as a counterweight. All of which came about as a way of thinking of why the darkened deeps exist, and that it's the ShadowDark eating its way into the planet from its position in the core, and its association with the prison then led me to the idea that it is the purpose of this world to keep the ShadowDark contained. So the world explicitly was made to imprison the ShadowDark. And with that, we've put the ShadowDark as an actor suddenly front and center. That's the core of our setting. It's the purpose of why there is a world, and it gives us all sorts of justifications for why is it that dungeons exist in this world. Well, because there is an instinctive affinity with all kinds of malicious creatures to burrow, to try and rejoin with the ShadowDark for strengths, for all kinds of coordinated efforts and such. Which is all well and good. It's a nice backdrop for a campaign. It is, however, something I would hasten to add that pretty much nobody in this setting is very likely aware of, at least nowadays, and at least among the mortal creatures. This goes, by the way, for almost everything we'll be building from now on. As far as the origin of the world goes, as far as the old gods / pantheon versus the new current pantheon goes, all of this I feel like is lost, forgotten, at the peril of the current residents of the world, of course, because this stuff is still directing events even today and culminating in, well, in our big campaign impetus, in the reason why there even is a purpose to this campaign and why we're even looking at these various places. Now, we know now that the ShadowDark is the reason the world exists, which then, of course, leads me to ask, why does the ShadowDark exist? And that gave me kind of a mental image that cracked it for me and gave me a bit of a creation myth that also explains where Koroth comes from and why there was an old pantheon and why there is now a new one. At least I think that's what it did. I haven't really thought this all the way through. That's why I'm recording it now, because I want to give this some structure and see whether it's actually all fitting together neatly, as I want it to be. And I think to unravel this all, we should go all the way to the beginning, before there even is this material plane, this world, before there even is a ShadowDark, and just answer quite plainly, where does the ShadowDark even originate? Origin of the ShadowDark. And again, I'm looking at this like a prompt, and I'm just looking at ShadowDark, and I'm thinking, okay, well, the ShadowDark is first and foremost the shadow of something. So where there is a shadow, we need something to cast the shadow, and we need a source of light. So we need something that was there before the ShadowDark was there, that casts this shadow, and we need the light as a source. And I think that which cast the shadow was Koroth. Koroth, to my mind, is something that was here before there was anything else except for this light. And in terms of a creation myth, I think it's pretty easy to extrapolate from, well, a lot of other existence creation myths, that the light came before all. And that is to indicate that the light created the space that is now occupied by the celestial bodies, by the physical planes that make up this world and contain the ShadowDark within it. But the light itself is not material, and the space the light created initially, I think, also wasn't material. So the light basically, if we think of kind of a classic D&D multiverse that has all sorts of interconnected pockets of other material realms, there is an empty pocket here that only exists in potential before anything is created, and then at some point an opening forms and the light comes in, fills it out, creates this blank canvas, and makes it possible for there to be something. And when I was thinking of what kind of a creature then is Koroth, why is Koroth here, and is Koroth the only creature, I think we can assume that Koroth is, of course, one of many, because that would put Koroth and the other many as our representation of this previous pantheon, even though they're not really gods, that we already know existed. So Shiga is another one of them. And if I think of what kind of creature are they, I think initially they're not even really distinct beings. They're just aspects of this light. They're kind of, if we think of the light as sort of a song, they're kind of the melodies that make it up. So the individual colors that make up the light prismatically, those are Koroth and Shiga and whoever else existed. The nature deity that our Lich killed potentially was one of them, maybe. And maybe we can keep running with this song analogy. So the light is accompanied by the, let's call it like the song of creation always, and it needs to resonate with itself. And that's where we have this prismatic, almost like a choir. So the light splits itself off into many different facets, while also still remaining outside of this new created multiverse space. So the origin of the light remains outside, and it forms itself inside here as this prismatic choir, one of whom will eventually become Koroth, one of whom will eventually become Shiga. But at the point where we're here now, before the ShadowDark exists, it's all harmony. Everyone has their own purpose, every color, every melody has their own role to play in this song of creation. And I think they're all sort of facing towards the light, and they're all picking up on the guiding melody of the light. They're facing outwards into the origin, and then behind them is what manifests, is the canvas upon which their song then starts creating things. At least in theory, at least that's how it will happen in all sort of other multiversal spaces. But here something goes wrong. For whatever reason, in the harmony of this melodious creation, there is this one facet, this one voice that embodies these elements of ambition, of perfectionism, of perhaps even like a budding idea of hierarchy. that it introduces to this whole creation process. I don't know if that makes sense. Like, I think if I think of these colors and these songs and melodies, I think of all natural forces, of all emotions, of all concepts that can exist. And one of these concepts is the idea of striving for something, of also striving for the best. And that goes maybe in this case wrong in that the voice that sings of ambition and perfection decides that it also knows better what this creation should be that they're currently weaving. So as this song goes on in a time before there even is a time, and as the interplay of the melodies happens, this one voice tries to become louder, and it tries to overshadow some of the other voices and convinces itself, and by that also becomes a self, so divorces itself maybe from this harmonious, we're all one, we're all having the same goal. This one voice tries to take charge and weave this light coming from the outside into its own design. And through that, it becomes more of an individual entity. And because it becomes an individual entity, all the others also suddenly start taking more shape. So all of a sudden we have this light source coming in, and now we have these amorphous creatures that are all bathing in this light, and they're all filtering the light into what will become creation, so the physical plane eventually, even though we're not there yet. And there is this one that tries to make itself louder, make its design more relevant. And in doing that, it creates for itself an aspect that the others don't have. It's no longer a prism that weaves this light into something. It suddenly becomes an obstacle that prevents the light from reaching and creates a shadow. And that shadow is connected to it, and that shadow spreads into the potential for creation, and that's kind of where it all goes wrong. So then all of a sudden we have this malignant entity with its many tentacles that is probably very, very upset that it even exists, because it doesn't understand its own purpose, it doesn't understand the whole point of this, and it starts lashing out. And that action, of course, has consequences. Again, now all the other aspects, these voices of the choir, as we may call them now, maybe, or the prismatic facets, they suddenly see that there's something happening in this newly created empty canvas of a multiversal pocket that requires an intervention in a way that isn't really part of the script, that isn't really foreseen. So maybe we have Koroth also somewhat blindsided, dumbfounded by what's happened there, because Koroth only intended for the best. Koroth only wanted his design, its design perhaps at this point, and at this point it's probably not even Koroth yet, it's just this one voice that is suddenly the individual that casts the shadow. I think this is also quite fundamental in the understanding of Koroth as an actor in this setting, that of course Koroth doesn't consider himself as the bad guy, and Koroth will always have these ambitions and this desire for correcting where it went wrong, except that maybe this expresses itself in just trying to wipe everyone out, or designing his chosen people and then somehow that still goes wrong and it's all kind of corrupted, especially because Koroth is linked to the ShadowDark. It is, in a way, it's part of him, but he is separate from it, and they're not unified in their wants and in their actions. So the ShadowDark is Koroth's mistake, and the ShadowDark basically wants to smother everything in darkness and make this painful light go away, and that's what drives this basically evil in this world. So ShadowDark seeks to smother the multiversal pocket it occupies in shadow darkness. Koroth considers it a mistake, but strives for correction and perfection in ways that always go wrong. At least back in the early days of this setting, at least in this part of history that is now forgotten. I think nowadays, after Koroth's fall and him ostensibly falling into the ShadowDark, I think whatever Koroth is now is probably completely corrupted by the ShadowDark. So Koroth now, after fall, is a very different entity. I think Koroth is now one with the darkness and has these destructive ambitions as well. So if Koroth comes back, it's bad news for everybody, because Koroth is now unmitigatedly trying to wipe everything out. So pre-fall is still trying to correct his mistake. Post-fall he's now one with the ShadowDark. And don't get me wrong, like pre-fall Koroth trying to correct his mistake will also always result in large-scale destruction, and his idea of correcting his mistake may as well also be almost the same as what the ShadowDark wants, which is just wipe everything out and start fresh. And that gives us like an endless well to draw from like evil activity in this setting. Now, how does the world actually come to be? I think we can also picture like an interplay there where the ShadowDark now exists and this choir, including Koroth, is sort of looking at it in horror, and the light is now permeating everything around them. And at this point, Koroth and the ShadowDark are the only like physical aspects in this. And now the other voices, the other facets also decide to become physical to correct whatever is going on here, and their duty is to deal with this mistake. So I think at first they try to destroy it, but they have to do something with the light here, and I think maybe that's where we bundle, like one of the voices is assuming a physical form that is bundling the light somehow, and that becomes the sun in this multiversal pocket. So it's like a massive physical entity, one voice of the choir that turns itself into this funnel of turning this like creation light into more like a physical manifestation, and just initially trying to burn out the ShadowDark. And I think that's how we form like the core of our world, because the ShadowDark then kind of weaves a protective mantle around itself, and that's also a material. For example, obsidian or something like will give this core material that the ShadowDark uses to protect itself from the light and create this planetary core. We use that also as a special material in our setting, so that gives potential for horrible weapons, armor, magic, etc. If you lay your hands on this ShadowDark imbued core material that it uses to protect itself from the light of the sun, it is bad news for everybody. So now we have this sun, we have this core, and we have the other voices of the choir still looking at this, and now there's this mantle here, so naturally one of the voices becomes matter, like rock, steel, everything that we can imagine that has the power to be impactful, and it starts bombarding this ShadowDarkened core and this new shell material, which then shatters it and leads to it being mixed up with this material that is now bombarding it and forming around it, and suddenly we have this sort of inner layer of our world. And then maybe another voice tries to do something else, and that creates our elemental layer, and before long all the voices are manifesting into natural forces, concepts, laws of physics, etc. So the Old Pantheon is actually the voices of this choir, this like prismatic choir, turned physical entities to contain. Basically, this choir realizes a mistake. At first they try to wipe the ShadowDark out. Once they realize that doesn't work, they're like, well, I guess that's what we do now until the end of time. We will be incarnating here into physical forms, and we'll keep this ShadowDark here. We'll keep it from escaping out into the wider multiverse, and that's how the world manifests. They're basically shaping the world as a prison for something that they failed to destroy. And that's their cosmic duty, and that's turning them into mountains and gravity and death. That, I think, is where Shiga enters the picture as a means to also ensure that all things here have an end and that time progresses, because you can't have an eventual end to all things if you don't have sort of a circle of life and existence. So Shiga is arguably setting itself apart by assuming a role that is even able to end like all the other forces here. And that's maybe also why Shiga is still around as a named entity without being a new god, which we'll have to touch upon later. I think I have an idea where they come from and what their role is and what sets them apart from these not really gods of the Old Pantheon. But for the most part, at this point, they're just nameless, and they are forces of this newly created material plane. So the world now exists. All voices have their place and their duties, and the ShadowDark is contained. All voices? Well, all except for one, of course, because there is now one voice left over who has no real purpose because he's already tied to the ShadowDark. So I think in this early period we can imagine Koroth basically as a disembodied consciousness floating around trying to figure out what his role is in this, because there isn't really anything left for him. He has already done his part, so he can't just incarnate into another aspect of the setting. I don't think that's how it works. Like, his voice is the voice of ambition gone wrong now that has created this darkness, and that's what he's for. So he's just lost. And I think that's where we come to sort of the role that Koroth takes on initially, because there is sort of an unintended side effect of creating the prison. The voices basically create or like place obstacles in the way of the ShadowDark's escape attempts, and that requires giving the prison a sort of immune system against the creations of darkness that the ShadowDark launches like periodically to free itself. So, for instance, attacking the elementals with something with these like giant world-eating worms. But it kind of snowballs from there, and it becomes more fine-grained and smaller scaled, and all of a sudden we have smaller entities, smaller creatures that are required as this immune system. And that's how we get elves and dwarves and humans and goblins and orcs and all kinds of other creatures, each at this point just intricately tied to a purpose that is given to them as part of this jailer paradigm. So the sentient creatures are made to serve as jailers, and their sentience is a byproduct of their, I'm calling it their mission. But that's also where I think the now incarnated forces are making sort of their first mistake by underestimating this sentience and what this means, because in a way that ability to think and react and fulfill and know their role also goes further than that. And that is something, I think that is where this is the distinction between what we said, these uncaring Old Pantheon gods in the past. Like, they don't care because they don't understand. Like, they don't understand wants, desires, dreams. Basically, they don't understand what I could also call ambition, but this guy without a purpose who finds these creatures who maybe also complain about their lot in life because they're like underground in pitched battle against forces of darkness, and that's the entirety of their existence. And on the surface they're fighting. There's always these constant darkenings with the ShadowDark trying to break out, and they raise their voices to these incarnates, these it's actually a good name, to these, the voices are the Incarnate Forces. So we'll call them the Incarnates. The peoples of the world have this desire to be heard, and the Incarnates don't understand why, because it's obvious what they have to do. They're basically there to contain the ShadowDark. That's it. There's nothing further. That's just not how the universe works. That's not how the multiverse works in this sense. The sentients will always have this built-in, well, flaw from a perspective of incarnates, that they won't just be satisfied with the lot that they're given. They will always strive. They will always have an imagination, which I think maybe the incarnates don't even have. So now we have this situation where the ShadowDark constantly tries to break out. The peoples of the world, the sentients, are rather dissatisfied with their lot in life. And there is Koroth, who understands them. And I think that gives us a good basis to build the elements of our prehistory that lead to the chasm and Koroth's fall. But we'll do that next time. So let me know what you think about this. Let me know what other elements you can think of, what aspects I may have overlooked, whether this makes any logical sense to you, whether this is a creation myth that kind of rings true for ShadowDark setting. I'm really curious about how you, well, I'm almost tempted to say, like, vibe with this, whether this hits a nerve or whether this is going in the wrong direction. Let me know in the comments, and we'll continue building this next time. So thank you very much for watching. I'll catch you then, and bye for now.